I will go through the three linear equations on page 18 of the workbook and go through the justifications of these detailed solutions step by step. The first one, the first line of any proof is always given. And then it's giving us the solution, and we need to write on the right-hand side the justification for the steps of the solution. The first one's done, but I'll just walk you through it, and then we'll do the second and third one. Line B of the equation, we know that subtraction is the same as adding the inverse. So that's what they're doing on line B, just subtracting the inverse. Now line C, adding 8 to both sides. Whenever you do something to both sides, it's one of the properties of equality. And here we're adding 8 to both sides, so that would be the addition property of equality. Next, we're adding these brackets right here where they weren't before, around -8 and +8. Whenever you move brackets around or add brackets around without changing the solution to the equation, that's the associative property. That's the property in step D that you're using. Next, -8 and +8, those are the additive inverses of each other. There's two types of inverse, the multiplicative inverse and the additive inverse. Additive inverse is the same number, opposite signs. So 8 and -8 are additive inverses of each other. And whenever you add an inverse, a number and its inverse, it will always equal 0. When you do a multiplicative inverse, it's a number, let's say 3, and its inverse is that number inverted like a fraction. So it's 1/3, and the result, when you multiply them, is always 1. So the additive inverse, you add them, a number, and the same number opposite sign, it equals 0. The multiplicative inverse is the number, and then the number inverted or turned upside down, the fraction turned upside down. You multiply them together, and it equals 1. Just one more example on the multiplicative inverse. The multiplicative inverse of 2/3 would be 3/2. You multiply them together, that equals 6/6, which equals 1. So those are the two types of inverse. Here it's an additive inverse, -8 and +8, and they equal 0. So we're using the inverse property. From step E to step F, we have x plus 0 equals 25. And when you add 0 to a number, it retains its identity. So still x equals 25. You add 0, 0 goes away, and now it still equals 25. It retains its identity. That's the identity property. Finally, the last step of any solution, you need to check it by substitution. So they're substituting 25 in for x to make sure that the solution was correct. Okay, let's go through this one. The first line is always given. Step 2, all they're doing is changing the order of the terms. So 7, it goes second place, x goes first place. That's the commutative property. A plus B equals B plus A. Now here we're adding a -7 to both sides. Again, when you do the same thing to both sides, add the same thing to both sides, it's a property of equality. We're adding, so it's the addition property of equality. Okay, now we're adding these brackets here. It's the associative. Those two numbers now are associating with each other, the associative property. 7 and -7, just like up here, those are inverses. 7 is the inverse of -7. And when you add those together, they equal 0. So that's using the inverse property. Next, x plus 0 equals -16. That means x without the 0. It retains its identity, so that is the identity property. And finally, you check by substitution. Okay, the last problem. The first step is always given. And then here, you're doing something to both sides. The same thing to both sides. That means it's one of those properties of equality. And here, we're multiplying 1/5 to both sides. So it would be the multiplication property of equality. Multiplication property of equality. Now we'll put brackets around 1/5 and 5. The bracket should probably go there. 1/5 times 5, those are the multiplicative inverses of each other, just like this right here, 3 and 1/3. Whenever it's a multiplicative inverse, it equals 1. So 1/5 times 5, that's the inverse property. But we did forget to write the bracket one on here. It's associative, sorry about that. Okay, so then inverse is next. 1/5 and 5 are inverses. They equal 1. When you're multiplying, doing the multiplicative inverse, it equals 1. Now, 1 multiplied by any number, it equals a number, and then you take away the 1, it retains its identity. That's the identity property. And then finally you check by substitution.